Following is a conversation with Professor Robert Plomin, a world-leading psychologist and geneticist who has spent decades studying how our genes influence who we are. He was rated top 100 psychologists alongside the likes of Freud and Jung. He's been cited over 160,000 times, and his work has revolutionised our understanding of how DNA and the environment shape things like our personalities, our choice in romantic partners, and mental health. Welcome to Bridging the Gap. I guess where I wanted to start, a common misconception among the public is that our personality and who we are is a result of our environment and our nurture, and your research has revolutionised our understanding of this. What role do genetics play in who we are?
Yeah, a lot of big questions there, but it is right. You know, when I started in graduate school in psychology, the University of Texas at Austin in the early 1970s, the textbooks in psychology were totally environmentalistic, you know, assuming everything you are is what you learned. Schizophrenia was caused by what your mother did to you in the first few years of life. I mean, it must be hard to imagine that now, but that really was the case. And genetics was a four-letter word. So it wasn't just that people were ignorant of it, they were really, after the Second World War and Nazi Germany, people were very uncomfortable, especially in America, with the word genetics even. So we've come such a long way from that time when people thought nothing was heritable, influenced by inherited DNA, to realizing everything is heritable. You can't find any trait in psychology that does not show genetic influence. And that includes personality. And so it's been a dramatic shift since the 70s, and I think it's due to the buildup of data. There's like a mountain of data now where a reasonable person just can't ignore the importance of genetics. And then the DNA revolution came along, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, but I never thought would happen in my lifetime, where we're actually finding the genes responsible for some of this genetic influence throughout psychology.
You've said that DNA is the major systematic force making us who we are. What does that mean, and how did you find that out?
Yeah, well, that is more a matter of what we call quantitative genetics, like twin and adoption studies that have been going on for 100 years. And twin studies it's a natural experiment comparing identical and non-identical twins. And the adoption method is like a social experiment in which you take families where they share genes and environment, but you separate them into families who share genes but not environment, called nature, and nurture families who share environment, not genes. So children who are adopted away from their birth parents share genes with those parents but not the environment. Adoptive parents share environment but not genes. So that allows you to separate familial resemblance into genetic and environmental components, because up until the last few decades, psychologists assume that things run in families for reasons of nurture, family environment, from Freud onwards. And that's why schizophrenia was thought to be due to what your mother did to you in the first few years of life. So it was a reasonable assumption, but it was actually very wrong, which we'll get into. And together, twin studies, thousands of twin studies, and adoption studies converge on the conclusion that everything that's been studied in psychology shows significant genetic influence. So that's how we got to the idea that genetics is important. But you said, you raised the title of my book, Blueprint, which how DNA makes us who we are. And that is how it makes us who we are as individuals. And that's a really important distinction. So everyone would agree height is highly heritable. And it's actually about 90% heritable. But that doesn't mean that you grew to your height 90% because of your genes and 10% by the environment. We're talking about differences between people in a population. So we're saying, why are you taller than some other people? And that really is an important distinction here. And the other aspect of it, well, I'll get into the caveats later, but the reason why I'm saying DNA is the major systematic force making us who we are as individuals is that we've shown that most traits in psychology are 50% heritable, not 90% like height, but 50%. And that means of the differences we observe, in traits like schizophrenia or reading disability or ADHD, 50% of that liability is due to genetics in the population. But that means 50% isn't genetic. And what we call environment in genetics is really just non-genetic. It's a residual thing. It's like what we can't explain genetically, we call environment. And that turns out to be a whole lot broader than anyone ever thought, because they thought environment is nurture. It's family environment. What this research has shown is that although the environment accounts for the other 50%, it's not due to nurture. It's not due to growing up in a family with someone. The environment's important, but it's not that systematic family environment. And we can get into that. It's called non-shared environment. 30 years of research, scores of studies trying to say, well, what is it? We don't really know. And I think that's because it's not systematic. It's random. In my paper in 1987 that first talked about this, we called it the gloomy prospect. There's a lot of possibilities. It could be accidents, illnesses, differences in parental treatment. There's a lot of things it could be. Judith Harris, in a famous book called The Nurture Assumption, said, well, maybe we've been looking in the wrong place. It should be peers, because if kids in a family share different friends. So people have looked at lots of these things, but they all come up kind of empty-handed. They just don't explain why children in the same family are different. Because that's what we're looking for here, is sources of environmental influence that don't make children in a family similar, because that's totally explained by genetics. So what I'm working on now is something that talks about stochastic influences, which is just the idea that the environment might be much more random than we thought. And it's such an important concept because it means that we have a lot less control than we think. And for example, parents have much less control than they think over how their children come out. So we can talk about all of those issues, but in answer to your question, what we're saying is DNA is the major systematic force making us who we are as individuals. The environment's important, but as best we can tell, it's not operating in the simple, systematic ways we thought, like parenting.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong on that. You've said that DNA, genetics is what makes us similar. Environment, that you said non-shared environment is what makes us different.
Sort of. From an evolutionary perspective, we have 3 billion base pairs of DNA. Those are the steps in the spiral staircase of the double helix of DNA, And of those 3 billion base pairs, you and I and everybody in the world is similar for at least 99%, maybe 99.9%. But with 3 billion base pairs, that means if 1.1% differs, that's a lot. That's millions of DNA differences between us. So what makes us human is the 99.9%. What makes us individuals is that 0.1%. So that's one answer to your question, about what makes us different. But genetics makes family members different, because you share 50% of your genes. That means you don't share 50% of your genes. Genetics predicts that kids growing up in the same family are different as well as similar, whereas the environmental theories we have in psychology assume that the family environment is monolithic, and so it makes children growing up in the same family similar. So much so they never even studied more than one kid in a family, because, duh, you have parents, and if you had another kid, they have the same parents. So what difference could it make? So the environment also, we're now saying, it does have an important effect. It accounts for the other half of the variance, but it's not systematic. It's not due to family environment. So yes, it makes us different, but we don't know what it is. And the big difference between DNA and the environment is we know the structure of DNA. We know the DNA code. We've sequenced the whole genome, all 3 billion base pairs of DNA. We know what's transmitted and how it's transmitted. And it's a limited number. 3 billion is a limited number. Now think about the environment. What causes the environment? We don't know how it's transmitted. We don't know what's transmitted. There's no environmental code And so the paper I'm working on now is called Genetics is Easy, the Environment is Hard.
Kind of going back to where we started, I feel like personality is a really good example to demonstrate this evidence. What role does DNA play in shaping personality characteristics like the classics, neuroticism, extroversion, introversion?
Mm-hmm. Well, the first law of behavioral genetics is everything is heritable. And that means personality is heritable. Some things are more heritable than others. And by inherited, I mean inherited DNA differences between us, that 0.1% of DNA that differs. That's really what we're talking about here. Now, some things are more heritable than others. Personality is less heritable than some other traits, like cognitive traits are maybe 60% heritable. But 40% it's a long way from 100%, but compared to other, we call it effect sizes in psychology, it's off the scale. So if you put everything else we know about personality development together and you try to predict a kid's personality, if you explain 5% of the variance, I'd be amazed. But here we're talking about, not 5, 15, 25, 40% of the variance. It's really an amazing amount of predictive power. And what we're doing now with the DNA revolution is beginning to identify the actual genes that can predict behavior, like personality, psychopathology, cognitive abilities.
I remember that research shocking me so much when I first read it, both in your book and also heard it in one of your lectures. The fact that 40% of the variation is a result of personality, I think it's something that quite a lot of people maybe struggle to accept. Did it surprise you when you first found that result, or did you have substantial conviction that would be the case?
Well, when I started, I was working with animals, and there the demonstrations of genetic influence are incredibly powerful, although people don't quite understand it. Do you know animal breeders have known for 10,000 years that you can breed for traits? And if you can breed for them, that's like the bottom line of genetic influence. And animal breeders breed for behavior as much as they do for body size and that sort of things. So being in the animal literature research, I was familiar with old selection studies, and you can select for personality in mice, like exploratory behavior, emotionality, and these are really precisely observed. You don't give them self-report questionnaires. You actually observe their behavior, and you see some mice are just much more aggressive than others. Some mice are more emotional, and a lot activity level. So these selection studies, which in mice, where you can breed every 3 generations a year or whatever, unlike humans, you can show there's one study of 30 generations of selection for open field activity and emotionality. And so you start with heterogeneous mice that differ genetically. And you don't have to be a geneticist to know. If you want to breed for it, you take the most active males and females. You at least are a geneticist enough to know you got to mate males with females. Pick the most active ones, and then pick the least active ones. And if you do a good study, you have a control line where they're not selected. So you see if the base rate changes over the population. And what this study showed is generation after generation, for 30 generations, it was like linear increase. So much so that at the end of 30 generations, any offspring in the high active line in a 3-minute test would run the length of a football field. The low active mice hardly moved. So it's really quite an amazing demonstration of the power of genetics. So I came out of that tradition, and so I knew about some of the early twin and adoption studies, and even though I had never heard about the word genetics in my undergraduate psychology courses, I was prepared to consider genetic influence. I had no idea it would be as powerful as it is, or that everything would be heritable. I started out, because I worked with mice, in those days there was no health and safety, and I was interested in evolutionary implications. And so I trapped mice in very different climates. I was at the University of Texas, so I could go down to the deserts of Mexico, getting mice as high as I could in the Rocky Mountains, and then getting them in the wet east part of Texas. So they differ a lot geographically and in terms of climate. And I was looking for the effects of that sort of evolutionary pressure. You know, surely the mice very high up, we got as high as like 8,000 feet or so in the Rocky Mountains, really high. Mice don't go much higher than that. And you'd expect they'd be different than mice in the deserts, for example. So then we tested them, and we brought them into a lab, and I raised them and then tested the offspring, you know, in a lab. And I was astounded to find that the differences within a region were far greater than the differences between regions. Yeah. So, and partly that has to do with the way mice work. They establish demes. So the young males are kicked out and they have to find their own territory. Most of them don't make it, but those that do set up another colony. So there's a big founder effect that makes them different between mice on one side of the barn and another side of the barn, but they differ more. The differences within regions are far greater than what I thought would be the evolutionary pressure of very different climates, for example. So I was prepared to, from the mice, to realize that genetics might be, very important. And then the early twin and adoption studies were suggesting genetic influence as well.
Yeah. What was it that made you not switch, but you then started focusing on humans?
Yes, I started to say there was no health and safety then. As a graduate student working with these mice, which I had to bring into the lab, because you couldn't test the mice the mice that you trapped, and brought in a van down to the University of Texas. So I had to breed them and then study their offspring. And so as a graduate student, I was given a closet, basically, that was unventilated. And it turns out almost half of us would become allergic to mice because they're super allergenic in that they have this dander. It's sort of a sex hormone that, if you get a lot of exposure to it, most people would develop an allergy. And I developed a severe allergy, so much so that I had to finish the study with a filter tank sort of thing.
Oh my goodness! Really?
Yeah. Even today now, 50 years later, if there were mice here, I'd know. I could tell you because I'd start getting stuffed up, and then my eyes would start to get sore. Yeah. So as a result, I sure wasn't going to continue working with air tanks and stuff.
Yeah.
So I decided that I'd have to switch to humans, and I did by starting to work with personality. And I wrote 2 books as a graduate student on temperament, which we thought of as early appearing, highly heritable personality traits. Arnold Buss and I, he was my supervisor, we thought some traits ought to be more heritable than others. And I bet if we asked you, what traits would you think? You'd pick things like, well, activity level seems to be highly heritable, right? And so we used evolutionary considerations to say, what traits do you see in all mammals? And it's like activity, emotionality, and sociability, gregariousness, and we thought impulsivity as well. So that's EASI, easy traits we thought were candidates, and they're also early appearing in humans, which is another thing you might expect for a trait that's highly heritable. But the end of that, like 10 years of research, it turns out those traits are no more heritable than other traits.
And something you show so well early on in your book Blueprint, one of your more recent books, that I think everyone needs to read in order to truly understand who they are and what makes us us, is early on in the book you provide this table which or this graphic which explains the heritability of a number of different traits and some conditions as well. But before I list some of them and ask you about them, I thought it'd be good if we, and you've hinted at it a bit already, define heritability. Could you explain what that means? No,
that's a really good point. It's probably the most misunderstood 6-syllable word in biology. So what it's referring to is, as I said, individual differences in a particular population at a particular time, and the extent to which those differences, like in personality, are due to inherited DNA differences, which is what we talk about as genetics, or they're non-genetic, they're due to something else, which we tend to call environment. But we now know it's not just nurture, it's not family environment. But it is environmental in the sense that it's not genetic. But that's a very narrow definition of genetic and a very broad definition of what we call in psychology environment, right? Because it doesn't mean family environment, it could mean accidents, illnesses, biological factors. Maybe we'll get into that. So heritability is often confused with fate and determination, and it's so important to emphasize we're not talking about hardwired single gene influences. And the problem is everybody learns about genetics from Mendel's pea plants. And what Mendel studied were single gene mutations in pea plants. We have thousands of single gene mutations, and they're like hardwired in the sense that if you have the single gene mutation for Huntington's disease, like Woody Guthrie, you will die from Huntington's unless something kills you first. So if you learn about it that way, and then I use the word genetic, you immediately think of single genes that are hardwired and deterministic. But the thing about psychological traits and most common medical diseases as well is they're not single gene. They're all influenced by genetics. Everything is heritable, but they're caused by many, many genes of small effect. And that's not just semantic. It switches from hardwired, deterministic, fate, you can't do anything about it, fatalism in a way, to probabilistic propensities. We're talking about influences, not hardwired programming.
Can you explain probabilistic propensity? I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, when we say genetic influence, we really do mean influence, not determination. If you have, we'll talk about polygenic scores, but we can now predict to what extent, say, you have genes, genetic risk for, like in my case, body mass index obesity. So that's my highest polygenic risk score. So we can predict from DNA alone that I'm at the 94th percentile for BMI. And my actual BMI is sort of borderline overweight, thanks to Ozempic. It used to be much higher than that. So by probabilistic propensity, what we're talking about is not a single gene influence that's deterministic and hardwired, like the thousands of single gene mutations we have, which fortunately are extremely rare. The psychological traits, complex traits, and common disorders in psychology and medicine are not due to one gene, they're due to many, many genes. And as a result, it's probabilistic. That is, it's not deterministic. All we can say is if you have, as I do, a genetic risk for obesity, it doesn't mean I'm going to be fat, because I'm not fat. But it means other things being equal, I'm more likely to be fat than someone else. And that's true for all the genetic influence on common traits and complex traits and common disorders. Other things being equal, you're more likely than someone else, say, to become alcoholic or schizophrenic or have reading problems. But it's not hardwired. It doesn't mean you will become alcoholic, schizophrenic, or reading disabled. It's probabilistic. And that's really hard for people to understand. For a long time, we had this problem in media, like with newspapers. The headline writers are different from the people who write the story. And we emphasize to the journalists, we're talking about genetic influence, not a gene. So please don't have the gene for. Sure enough, the title comes out, the gene for autism, fill in the blank, has been found. So it really is an important distinction. And heritability, then, is talking about this variance in a population and the extent to which genetic, inherited DNA differences, and environmental influences account for the differences we observe. But it's not deterministic, it's probabilistic. So I hope that explains it, because it is such an important point.
100%, and I think that's unbelievably important background for what we'll now talk about, and explains it so well. So moving into that table that I'm thinking of from Blueprint, one of the statistics that shocked me the most is that school achievement is 60% heritable. a slightly hyperbolic question, but does that mean, is paying for private schools and tuition less important than we thought?
I would say definitely. I know you guys are all probably public school boys.
No, I was a state school.
Oh.
State school boy.
All right, good
We
for
all
you.
are, yeah.
Well, I know that's hard for people to accept, but if you're we haven't given people the background for this really, but the answer to your question is yes. Tested school achievement, like GCSE scores, are 60% heritable. Now, that means you could say only 60% of the variance is accounted for. But we've done research that says it's so important for people to realize we say significance, and we mean statistical significance. We don't mean socially significant. And you've always got to say, yeah, fine, but what's the effect size? 60% is like off the scale of anything we know. You smoke 2 packs of cigarettes a day, and I think your risk of dying from lung cancer is 20%. I mean, it's a bad thing to do. I'm not saying people should go out and smoke, but we've got to get a sense of the relative effect sizes of these things. And so a great example in this context is going to private selective schools. We'll back up and say, how much of the variance of GCSE scores can be explained by genetics? And the answer is 60%. Now let's look at something else like school quality. And the league tables for schools, Ofsted ratings, these very expensive, like £20,000 per visit, where they're the best estimates of a school quality you can get. They observe teachers in classrooms, they talk to the kids, they talk to the janitors, parents. They really get a good assessment of the school quality. And that becomes the league tables. And the league tables determine people's lives. I know parents who have moved across the street to get into a school with a higher, league table rating. So it really changes people's lives. So the obvious question is, how much variance is explained by these Ofsted school quality ratings of GCSE? And when I asked this about 10 years ago, nobody knew the answer. Because they're not thinking of effect sizes, And so the answer is 4%. And kids aren't randomly assigned to schools, and socioeconomic status is a big part of it. If you correct for socioeconomic status, it's 1% of the variance is accounted for, which is nothing. It's not a noticeable difference.
So 4% of the variance in school achievement is a result of an Ofsted rating, how the quality of that school.
Yeah, not the result of, but that's the index of school quality. And it's just to contrast that 4%, which is really 1%, because you can't change kids' SES. And so, but compare that then to 60% of the variance. So it's even worse than that, though, because we looked at kids. We have this large twin study called the Twins Early Development Study of 10,000 pairs of twins we've been studying for 30 years now. We just got a new grant from the Medical Research Council to follow the kids for the next 5 years, from 30 to 35 years of age. So it's the longest funded Medical Research Council program grant. So we're really excited about that,
I know it's early doors, so I don't know how much there is you can say, but could you explain some of what you'll look at there, what you aim to focus on for the next?
Yeah, well, I'll just mention that now, maybe come back to it later.
Yeah,
it's
cool.
Focusing on diagnosis of mental health problems. Because school, it was my focus in the school years and through university, but now they're hitting 30, you want to ask different questions. And we're asking questions about life sorts of changes that happen then, marriage and that sort of thing. But the real focus is on psychopathology, because most psychopathology is developing by that point. There's a few later onset ones, but the vast majority of the problems are there, so we can use this longitudinal data to understand what's happening there. And a large part of it involves getting into NHS records and sort of getting diagnostic information as well as self-report information. But going back to the GCSE thing to finish that story, we looked at kids who were in private schools, and they actually have higher polygenic scores for educational achievement. And certainly the schools did not change their DNA, right? And so you'd say, maybe they've just selected kids who have higher polygenic scores. And it's really true that the private schools, most of the fee-paying schools, involve selection. And the highest scoring ones have interviews. And it turns out they're selecting kids on the basis of their intelligence and their achievement at school, which seems kind of obvious, but then you realize there's no added value. If we select kids who do well at school and who are super bright, they're going to do well at school. But have we added the value? And we haven't. If we correct for the things that the schools select on, like intelligence, we have cognitive test data on these kids, and their earlier achievement, there is no effect of going to these selective schools. It's self-fulfilling prophecy. You select very bright kids who do well at school, and yeah, they do better at school, but not because of what you did. So you ask about parents paying the money to go to private schools. If you're doing it because you think you want your kids to get better scores, they're not going to. Now, in their cups, a lot of parents will tell you they really are sending their kids there. It's almost like naughty to say, but they want their kids to be with the right sort of kids. They want to get connections. They're doing it for status reasons in some ways. And it is true they have more resources. You know, like it's sad that the state schools, my grandson's interested in art and computer sorts of things, but those programs are really going by the boards because there isn't enough money for them in the state schools. And so, you know, the private schools have more resources, and maybe they're more fun places to be or whatever, but I think parents who can't afford the hundreds of thousands of pounds ought not to feel bad about it. Because now with Ofsted ratings, you know, I didn't mean to say Ofsted ratings are no good. They actually did a lot of good getting rid of the worst schools, you know, and bringing everybody up to a good enough level of education. And I think it is good enough in the sense that the good kids will have enough resources to do well. So I think Ofsted ratings were good, but I'm more concerned about parents who think they're really messing up their kids' prospects by not sending them to expensive private schools. And I would say the evidence is just not there. In general, one of the things I'm sure we'll get into is that parents don't make as much of a difference as they think. And, you know, and so the upshot of that is, you know, not to worry so much, you know. It doesn't mean you tell kids, oh, school isn't important. It is important. But some kids love school, like I did. And I did really well at school. I learned to read. I found it easy. And I get rewarded for it. I get scholarships and things like that. My sister didn't like school. And, you know, people assume, well, she's just not trying hard enough. You either blame the schools or the parents or the kids. But it's genetics. And I think the education system has come to recognize that genetics is the major systematic force making kids do how well they do on these educational achievement tests. So it really is a very important thing for people to understand, especially as people think about having kids. You know, because there's thousands of these child-rearing books. And the scary thing for psychology is that parents, on average, buy 1.7 of these books. Well, if they pick up 2 books, what they'll find quickly is there's completely contradictory evidence. It's argument by authority. Dr. So-and-so says you must do this, you must not do that. And then you get another book that says the opposite. There's very little empirical work done to say, this is what you must do. There's a wonderful book by Oster, O-S-T-E-R, who used to be an economics writer, and when she got pregnant, she decided, well, being data-oriented, she'd look at the data. And it's called Crib Sheet, and she ended up concluding that there's nothing you can tell parents absolutely about what they should or shouldn't do, partly because kids are different. Yeah. The same thing doesn't work for kids. So it says the only thing you can tell them is get your kids vaccinated, which is something right now that's, again, controversial, especially in America with Trump and RFK Jr.
I've always said I think a blueprint should be in the parenting book group category for sure. Another statistic I wanted to bring up with you, you mentioned earlier body weight, BMI. Weight, correct me if I'm wrong, is 60% heritable.
Yeah.
How did you find that out? And equally, what does that mean for society? I feel like this statistic shows how much more sympathetic we should be to people who are overweight.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's a real issue now because there is a fat shaming that goes on. And that's assumed, skinny people just don't understand how us people who are genetic fatties, how difficult it is. I mean, if you're skinny, you just say, well, just don't eat so much, But there are two psychological processes involved in weight. And, one is satiety. Normal people, when they're, say, at dinner in a restaurant with people, they say, oh, no, I'm full, I couldn't eat anymore. And they don't eat anymore. People like me, though, just are talking, you have a little bit more of this, a little bit more of that, you clear the table before it's over. And you could say, well, yeah, get more self-control, but life doesn't work like that. You have these moments where you're enjoying conversation and you just eat, And then the other thing is responsiveness to food cues. If I go by, I even think about going by a bakery store with the smell of fresh bakery, fresh bread. I can't bake bread anymore because the thought of warm baked bread and the idea of butter melting on that warm bread, I'm salivating now, even just thinking about
likewise.
it. So, so it's much more difficult not to gain weight, but then there are also factors that make it harder to lose weight. And it's the simple notions of metabolic rate or whatever, these things aren't simple. I think a lot of this is much more complicated psychologically than people think. So it is really exactly right to say if genetics is important, that means we don't blame people so much. We realize there are differences, but it doesn't mean I'm determined to be fat, because to the contrary, knowing that I'm at high genetic risk for that kind of makes me more motivated to do something about it.
And what could go either way, couldn't it?
It could, exactly right.
You could become defeatist in the sense that, oh, well, if I'm destined to be fat, then what's the point of doing anything?
But, in a lot of cases, like the most heritable personality trait in infancy is shyness. And in America, that's thought to be pathological. You could send your kid to a clinician so that they don't have this pathology of shyness, whereas people in Britain think Americans are pathological for lacking any sort of reticence, Everyone has the experience. If you're on a plane with an American sitting next to them, they'll tell you their whole life story and sex history before you get off the airplane. And so with a shy child, it's important to recognize that recognize and respect genetic influences on these differences. And if your kid is shy, you can absolutely do something about it. Not by taking them to a clinician, but to simply say, you're only shy when you're meeting people you don't know. And so if you take them to a birthday party, you don't just drop off your shy child with these people they don't know. You arrange to take a friend with them so that they're not totally with strangers. But I'm actually shy, and what I find interesting is to say, as I get older, I can recognize I'm shy. It doesn't mean I can't do anything about it. If I'm in a situation where I have to be gregarious, I can do it. But I recognize I don't like cocktail parties with a bunch of people you don't know. Now you take someone who isn't shy and is more gregarious. Sociability and shyness are not the same thing. They're not opposite ends of the continuum. And the problem is, if you think of the 4 quadrants of sociability and shyness, the problem is if you're sociable and shy. I'm shy, but not sociable, so it isn't much of a problem. And as a result, as I get older, I just say, I don't like cocktail parties. Someone who is sociable, they say, what is meet all these people you don't know, interesting people and everything. If I get stuck at one of those parties, then I just find someone I find interesting and go off in the corner and talk to them, So the general point you're making is to be more accepting of other people, and in the specific case of fat and fat shaming, to recognize that it's a lot harder for some people not to gain weight and to lose weight. But just more generally, recognizing and respecting genetic sources of individual differences, not to get deterministic about it, but just to say people are different, and to some extent, and to a surprising extent, those differences are due to inherited DNA differences. And not just in our children or in other people, but in ourselves as well. Part of understanding yourself is to realize your genetic influences. There's a great story there about Skinner, as the ultimate in America. B.F. Skinner founded behaviorism, and to the point of thinking that the environment is so much in control, he raised his daughter in a controlled, almost cage-like environment so that he could completely control the environment. There's a story there. But he's the ultimate environmentalist in the sense of everything is learned about you. But he wrote a book on old age when he lived to his 80s, and in it he said, the older I get, the more I become who I am, kind of recognizing what I would say is genetic influence. He might have said, well, it's his early training or whatever. But I think it's exactly right about genetics. Like the older I get, the more I see aspects of my father. And most people, what they recognize is more the negative aspects of it. Like with my father, proneness to anger. I mean, he was a very nice, gentle person until he wasn't, like, road rage and feelings, when people slight him or whatever, instead of just, saying, yeah, that guy's a jerk, or whatever, you get very angry. It's a quick trigger, on temper, and I definitely have that. And so what do? You don't just, as you say, you can take two courses of action. You can just say, oh, well, I can't do anything about it, which I think is a huge mistake. Instead to say, no, you recognize you've got this tendency. So if you have any brains, you say, well, what can I do to mollify that? And like mindfulness training and that sort of thing tells you, if you can change it in the first few seconds, you just say, oops, that's a triggering event. I can stop myself from being angry. And you're motivated to do that because if you get very angry, you suffer a lot more than the other person, because it's not like, and then it goes away. I mean, if I get really angry, I can be angry for hours, and then you ruminate about it and say, that guy really was a jerk, I should have punched out his lights, and it's no good. It's not good for you. So I think a bit of stoicism and mindfulness and recognizing the genetic sources of individual differences, not just in others, especially in our kids. And that's why I think, as you say, it's important for parents, if they think they mold kids to be what they want them to be, they must read my book. Because these thousands of other child-rearing books hardly mention genetics. And I think the single most important thing to know about parenting is genetics.
It's funny, isn't it? Because so many people get annoyed when maybe you say, oh, you're like your mum or you're like your dad. But everything we've spoken about here is why that's not surprising.
Exactly right.
Another trait slightly related to school achievement, intelligence. How heritable is it? And equally, you've shown that it increases over time. What does that mean?
The heritability increases over time. Well, in psychology, it's good to keep an eye on things that are not what your grandmother knew. Kind of surprising, because a lot of psychological findings, people say, yeah, okay, that research is important because a lot of what we think is important isn't important. So it's not to dismiss that research, but it's more interesting to come up with something that people didn't know. So if people understood what we were talking about with heritability, and we ask, what do you think about the heritability of intelligence through the lifespan? Do you think it becomes more heritable or less heritable? And some people would say, well, it doesn't change because it's heritability. Well, that missed that earlier point that we're just describing what is in a population. We're not saying what could be. And genetics does change. You know that, like baldness, that comes on later in life. And people, I'm sure, recognize that that's substantially genetic. So there are genetic changes, obviously. Schizophrenia doesn't show up until the late teens, early 20s. So it's an important point that heritability of intelligence increases over the lifespan. And it's interesting because it's not what most people would assume. If people listening have understood what we were saying about heritability, they know it's only describing a particular population, which would be like a particular age. Heritability can change. And if people understand that, and you ask them about heritability of intelligence, they probably say heritability should go down, because during life, the Shakespeare's slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, accidents, illnesses, they pile up. And so you'd think environmental influences cumulatively have a greater effect, which means the genetic influence should relatively have less of an effect. But it turns out the other way, which is interesting, that the heritability of intelligence decreases linear from only about 20%, which is still bigger than any effect size in psychology, in infancy, 40% in childhood, 60% in middle age, and some studies suggest in later age, if you control for dementia, is 80%, like a linear increase over the lifespan. And then the question is, but why? Because it does seem counterintuitive. Why should genetics become more important? And the counterintuitiveness is something just to be mentioned. It's the idea that genetics is like fixed at the moment of conception. And that is all the DNA you inherit. But clearly, DNA is turning on and off minute by minute as we talk. We're changing the expression of genes for neurotransmitters, for example. So genes aren't this, they aren't, it's like, if it's genetic, it should be there at infancy. But obviously, it isn't, right? Things do change. And so the heritability increases. The answer to the question is why. We don't really know, but most people think it has to do with what we call genotype-environment correlation. That is, the DNA, people might be surprised that the highest heritable cognitive test is vocabulary, because they say, but you learn vocabulary words. It's true, but some kids learn it a lot better, easier than others. And that's how the genetics works.
One of the things I really wanted to ask you was how much of a genetic component is there in choosing our romantic partner?
Well, everything is heritable, so there is some heritable influence on your choice of partners. And it's probably bigger than we think, in that there's something called assortative mating. So there are two aphorisms around. One is that similarities, like attracts like, right? Yeah. But then there's another one, opposites attract. Yeah. Totally different points of view. But it turns out the former is right, that there's no psychological traits for which opposites attract, other than sex. Yeah. But you'd think, like, if you were emotionally very labile, you might want to pick a partner who's more stable and more of a rock. But it isn't like that. The assortative mating, that is, it's the tendency for like to mate with like. And for personality, it's only modest, like correlation of 0.1. I assume listeners know that correlations go from 0 to 100, 1.0. And 0.1 is a low correlation, only accounts for 1% of the variance. So for height and weight, it's about 20%, 0.2, and which surprises people, because you do notice assortative mating for height. In general, if you see a tall woman, she's with a taller man. On average, that's all we're talking about in the population. But that's 0.2. For vocabulary, the assortative mating correlation is 0.6. And that has a lot of genetic implications, because it means if one of your parents is highly verbal, it means on average your other parent's going to be too. And it also means that if people are dismissive of, well, how do you measure cognitive abilities and all of that, or that saying intelligence tests only measure intelligence is only what intelligence test measures, it's like circular. It's nonsense. If you're single and you're at a bar meeting someone, you're testing their intelligence, especially their verbal intelligence, and especially their vocabulary. There's other aspects of verbal ability. You're probably not getting at their spatial ability or memory so much, but I think people will recognize that when someone opens their mouth in 30 seconds, you get an idea of how verbally bright they are and if you're going to have anything to talk about the next morning. Yeah. So assortative mating is really important for cognitive abilities, and that means that we're already doing sort of like genetic selection, because it's the most heritable trait, cognitive trait.
That's really interesting. So tell me if I've misunderstood you, but there's a large genetic component in that we seek out people that have a similar genetic makeup to us.
Yes.
You touched on this a good amount in the book. I want to talk about the genetic component of mental illness.
Mm-hmm.
Could you explain what your research has found pertaining to that?
Well, it's not my research, right? This is a large community of researchers, but actually quite small per capita. I mean, the number of genetic researchers in psychology or in the behavioral sciences quite small compared to everybody else, but they punch way above their weight in terms of publications and grants, and most importantly, findings. I think some of the biggest findings in psychology have come from genetic research, like the first one being that first law of genetics, that everything's heritable. But here's another one, and that is a chapter in my book Blueprints called "The Normal is Abnormal." Did I say that right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, or "The abnormal is normal," I guess is the better way of phrasing it. And that's the idea that, well, first of all, everything's heritable. So there's no aspect of psychopathology that does not show genetic influence. And so that isn't a finding unique to mental illness. But it was very important because for a long time, parents of children who became schizophrenic are told, they don't find out till they're in the late teens, early 20s, and then they were told that it was because of what you did to them in the first few years of life. Completely, it's all mother blaming, this environmentalistic stuff. And the thing is, it's wrong. And so parents of kids with psychopathology are kind of big supporters of genetic research. So it's most important to recognize there's a strong genetic component. So your point about blaming people, recognizing and respecting individual differences is important. And especially in terms of the parents. They didn't cause their kid to become schizophrenic. And there's several findings, new findings that are really interesting, and that is, it takes a while, I'm hesitating because it takes a while to explain this, but we're stuck with a medical model that assumes that there's a simple cause of a disorder or a disease. Like you take COVID. You only get COVID if you have that SARS virus, that particular type of SARS virus. So in the early days in February 2020, trying to figure out what causes it, you got to diagnose it. You got to say, do you have that or not? And then, we developed those tests that could really tell you if you have it or not. And the idea is then you find the cause. And the cause is the SARS virus. That's the medical model. And it works really well if you have simple causes. Like the first big example in epidemiology where people getting cholera. What causes that? First, you got to diagnose and say, this guy with a tummy ache, does he have cholera? No. This guy definitely has cholera. Okay, and what ties them together? And it was infections in the water supply. And so simple causes work well for the medical model. But as we've said, for common medical diseases, like 90% of the medical burden in society is not due to those things. It's due to these complex traits like blood pressure, heart disease. And the same thing's true in psychology, that the medical model doesn't work right because all these disorders that we have, psychopathology, they're not due to they don't have a simple environmental cause like parenting, nor do they have a simple single gene cause. They're substantially genetically influenced, but it's not these hardwired deterministic factors. So if there are many, many genes involved that increase our risk for, say, schizophrenia, it means that genetically we're talking about a normal distribution. I don't know if people know.
Yeah, what do you mean by normal distribution?
Yeah, that's that bell-shaped curve where most people are in the middle, and as you move farther to the higher low end, there are fewer and fewer people. And with genetic risk, we now can measure these DNA differences, and they are perfectly normally distributed as this bell-shaped curve. They have to be, because that's the central limit theorem of statistics, of probability. It's like flipping a coin 10 times or 100 times. How many times do you get heads? How many times do you get tails? You get a perfectly normal distribution. There are some times where you get 10 heads in a row or 10 tails in a row, but most of the time it'll be 50-50 in the middle, right? And that's what we're doing here. We're flipping alleles, they're called. The alternate forms of genes that we're talking about, the 0.1% of DNA that differs, most of those are called single nucleotide polymorphisms. That's, you know, the four-letter alphabet of DNA, A, G, C's, and T's. Say if there's everyone has an AA, and then there's a mutation somewhere where someone has a T, then in the population you eventually get people who have an A and a T, or a T and a T, or an A and an A. That's what we're talking about here. But those are alleles then. So it's like flipping coins in the sense that if we now take a lot of those genes, each which have two alleles, you get this perfectly normal distribution of risk. So that means genetically, from a genetic perspective, there's no breakpoint there. People who have schizophrenia have higher polygenic scores for schizophrenia. But there's no dividing line there. In fact, the neat thing is to realize that we all have thousands of genetic risk factors for schizophrenia. The issue, it's quantitative, not qualitative. It's not dichotomous disorders, but rather continuous distributions. And a lot follows from that, you know, in diagnosis. It's nuts to think there's a dividing line where you're either schizophrenic or not. And I thought when I first started talking about this 20 years ago, I thought psychiatrists would be very upset because they spend so much time deciding on the diagnosis. But they know it's not either or. You know, it's a gradation of schizophrenia. You don't wake up alcoholic or schizophrenic or obese or depressed or whatever one day. It's a gradual thing, and a lot of it has to do with functionality. You know, if you're, you know, you can function. Some people can function very well with kind of extreme risk for these things. So it's just we're talking about dimensions, not disorders, and if so-called disorders are really dimensions, you don't cure it because there's nothing to cure, but you can change the symptoms, you know. It's, again, cure is quantitative, not qualitative. You ameliorate the problem. It's not like the goal is to get rid of it. But like with SARS and COVID, you can say, here's this vaccine, and you can prevent people from getting it. And, you know, they don't get it. At least that's what we thought. Even there we know it's all much more quantitative than we used to think, you know.
How much does genetics influence things like anxiety and depression?
Yep. Well, first law of behavioral genetics kicks in here. Everything's heritable.
Everything's heritable.
Anxiety and depression are less heritable than many other, you know, maybe 30-40% genetic liability rather than schizophrenia and bipolar. The major psychosis is more like 50-60% genetic liability. I say liability because they're still dealing with zeros and ones. They're still saying diagnosed schizophrenia or not, you know, diagnosed major depressive disorder or not, you know, which I don't accept. I don't think that's the case. But it is the case, it is true that anxiety and depression are less heritable. I don't know if that's because they're more general. I mean, you know, what do you mean anxious or depressed? And are you depressed? Well, compared to what? Some days I am, some days I'm not. You know,
the definition's a lot broader.
It's a lot broader, isn't it?
Yeah. What about the topic of neurodiversity? What about conditions like autism and ADHD?
Yeah, I used to think, well, autism is one thing. If you've met autistic kids, it's one thing that really is a disorder. The people in that area now, beginning with Mike Rutter at the Institute of Psychiatry here, realized early on that it's a dimension, it's not a disorder. And I think it's also not a thing in a way. I mean, you know, this upsets a lot of people who feel relieved to say, my kid has autism. But, you know, there are children with autistic symptoms. They're not autistic kids. And if you ask, well, how does this exist? Why do we say there's autism? And it's because of Kanner in 1945 had some kids that had these collections of symptoms that make them look very different. But that doesn't mean it's a symptom, a syndrome.
Unless there's more you want to say on that topic, I would love to.
I think.
Yeah, go.
I would like to say.
Oh yeah, go please.
So why is there autism? Because Eric Kanner said so, and he had these kids who had this combination of symptoms like repetitive behaviors and communicative sort of issues, and not like looking you in the eye when they talk. But that doesn't mean that it is a thing, it is a disorder. And instead we find that those components of autism are less genetically related to each other than some things that are supposed to be completely different, like schizophrenia and bipolar. So I'm not saying that kids don't have problems, they do. And, but what's to be gained by accepting the medical model that says there are those autistic people and us normal people? It's dimensional. And so basically, even with autism, your question, which I used to think that really is a distinct disorder. It's not, apparently. It's dimensional from a genetic perspective, but there's a great disconnect between our current, we call it nosology, our current way of diagnosing psychopathology, and the genetic architecture between it. Because not only are these things all dimensional genetically, not discrete, no cutoff point for, there are no genes for schizophrenia or autism. It's a quantitative thing of genetic risk from many, many genes. But there's another genetic finding here that's very important, that's really new, and that is that we think part of the medical model is to say this disorder, cholera, is genetically it's distinct from another disorder, you know, like COVID. But with psychopathology, we think, for example, schizophrenia is distinct from bipolar, you know, the manic depression. And it's so much so that until the recent diagnostic manual, you couldn't be both, because it's the first dividing line in when you're trying to diagnose somebody. But now genetic studies have shown that the correlation genetically between schizophrenia and bipolar is 0.6, meaning that if you find a gene for schizophrenia, 60% of the time it'll be a gene for bipolar. Very highly correlated genetically. And we know that now from these genome-wide association studies where we look across the whole genome at millions of DNA differences and say which DNA differences account for a disorder. Well, one of the first studies were done with schizophrenia, and they found some. And then the first studies done on bipolar, it's the same ones, which blew people away. But now we can do more quantitative analysis of that to say that the genetic correlation is 0.6, which means genetically they're not very different. And another finding along those lines, anxiety, depression, the genetic correlation is 0.9. Genetically, there's hardly any difference between anxiety and depression.
Yeah.
So the general point I'm making is that it's sort of like Alice in Wonderland, this whole diagnostic scheme we have for psychopathology just has very little relationship to what we're beginning to see is the genetic architecture behind it. And the problem with psychopathology is, like Kanner and autism, every single psychopathology has been defined historically, not empirically. There's always a Kanner or somebody who first said, this is a thing. And unlike cognitive ability state, where it's been built up empirically from the ground up, rather from the top down, you know, someone saying this exists, and then you create this whole research area around that thing. So it does feel a bit like Alice in Wonderland, but I think people are beginning to wake up to this. The abnormal is normal, and then the idea that these things we think are genetically distinct are not.
I think so much of what we've spoken about is is so shocking to so many people, and like we mentioned earlier, can maybe feel a bit defeatist to some people. They go, oh, well, you know, what's the point? I don't have any control over anything. And you hinted at this a bit earlier when we were talking about weight and BMI, which is that no, it can be the alternative. One, it can be liberating, and two, it can highlight the fact that there is a lot we can do. On that, I wondered if you could explain a gene-environment interaction. What does that mean? We've spoken a lot about how much of an influence genetics have in who we are and how we develop, but we've also emphasised that there's an awful lot we can do along the way.
Right. Well, yeah, it's a good question. It's again another big question, but you started by talking about a defeatist attitude people might have if they have a fatalistic view. And I hope we've talked enough about it to realize that we're not talking about deterministic factors. We're describing what is in the population. We're saying to what extent in this population, with this age, and at this time, you know, like in 50 years ago, it could have been a different result. We're describing the extent to which inherited DNA differences make a difference. And that can change. It's a descriptive statistic. Just like means and variances of a population, they can change. That's what you want in a descriptive statistic. But that's very different, describing what is, from predicting what could be. In fact, there's no necessary relationship. So you can show that a trait, like people might be surprised, like dental issues like caries, you know, that shows substantial genetic influence, for example. But to say it's genetic doesn't mean there's nothing you can do. You can have a new intervention like preventive dentistry with flossing and staining your teeth and stuff that could eliminate something that otherwise would have been highly genetic. And it's also true with parenting. We're saying on average, parents don't make a difference in, say, their school achievement once you control for genetics. And of course, you have to control for genetics because parents and their children are 50% genetically related. But it doesn't mean that something like tiger parenting cannot have an effect. It's saying to the extent it exists, it doesn't have much of an effect. But if there's just a few parents that are going, you know, becoming helicopter parents and completely trying to control their environment, it could have an effect. But you got to be wary about thinking it must have an effect, because the evidence is parenting differences, and parents differ a lot already. You know, some parents are much more into pushing their kids hard at school than others. You got to be wary of just assuming that more parental attention makes a difference. I think in some ways that tiger moms work better with, you know, with certain types of families. I think kids who are genetically gifted, if parents don't recognize that some kids, like my sister, just wasn't academically oriented. And if you put pressure on her to do as well as her brother, for example, at school, it can be counterproductive. And it was, I think, in my sister's case. My parents weren't pushy that way, but she didn't do well at the same schools I was at, and people were saying, what's wrong with you? You know, you got to get more motivated or whatever. But I don't think she's academically oriented, and I don't think we should use that as a golden yardstick to the extent we do, because I don't think we need more PhDs. We need more plumbers and carers and teachers, and, you know.
This is an intentionally broad question, and we've hinted at it a bit already, but how much control do we have?
Well, I think the bottom line, the theme of my book, Blueprint, is how DNA makes us who we are. It's to recognize that genetics is the major systematic force making us who we are. The environment's important. It counts for 50% of the variance, but it's not the environment we thought it was, which is like systematic effects like parenting. And the other thing we touched on is that what looks like systematic effects of the environment can be the nature of nurture, can be genetic influences on the environment. I don't know if we actually talked about that, but a lot of the environmental measures we use in psychology show genetic influence. And someone's like, well, how can it be, an environmental measure be genetic? But it's just a word. What is it we measure? We measure things like life events. And thousands of studies use it as an environmental measure. But it shows about 30% heritability. And because the items are things like getting conflicts with people, have financial problems. It isn't the environment out there independent upon us. It's not imposed on us from the outside, which is the old environmentalistic way of thinking. A lot of I always say the environments experienced are the environments, perceived. It's not what's important out there. Like divorce of parents happens to two kids in the same family. So the event is the same, but the experience can be very different for two kids in a family. We know that from research. So the three major findings in Blueprint were, first, the DNA is the major systematic force mechanism. The second is the environment's important, but it's not the environment we thought. It's this non-shared environment, which increasingly we think is stochastic in the sense of idiosyncratic and not systematic. And then the third thing is what looks like systematic effects of the environment, like correlations between parenting and kids' outcomes, are substantially mediated genetically. So the result of that is to say that DNA is the major systematic force making us who we are as individuals. The environment's important, but it's not that systematic environment. And so in answer to your question of how much control do we have, the answer from that is less control than we thought, in the sense of changing our outcomes. Like if you're a parent and you think you can make your child into whatever you want them to be, it's not going to work. It's counterproductive. So you can change their behavior. I mean, if a kid's aggressive and they're hitting someone over the head, you can make them stop that behavior. But I don't think you're going to change the kid's personality much, because that's mostly genetic, and the environment is not it's these random environmental effects that we don't have control over, and we don't know what they are anyway. So parents have much less control than they think. And that section of the book was 7 pages, and it had much more attention than everything else probably put together, because it was entitled Parents Matter, but They Don't Make a Difference. And I hope listeners can understand what I mean by that. Obviously, parents matter. Kids can't survive by themselves. But even more than that, parents matter in that it's an important relationship with their child, not because it changes the kid's outcomes, but because it's a large part of your life. And you ought to think about your relationship with your kid in terms of a relationship where you do nice things for them because you love them and you want life to be good for them. You don't do it because you don't do things for them because you want to make them be what you want them to be, because it would almost be counterproductive to the relationship. And that's what I think is true of tiger parenting too. It works okay in families where you've got the genetics going for you, and then you push the environment as hard as you can. But even then, Francis Galton, Darwin's cousin who founded behavioral genetics, he had a famous saying, ability will out. Mostly, like you see that in schools. Like if you've met mathematically brilliant kids, you don't have to give them the best tutors. I mean, you just got to stay out of their way, and let them develop the way. And especially now with the internet and these online sort of math courses, the sky's the limit for kids in terms of learning math on their own. You don't have to make them do it. I mean, they love it. And it's another a thing that I've learned is that you think of what is the genetic influence on things like vocabulary or mathematical ability. And people think hardwired sort of neural wiring stuff, but it's not like that. I think it's more aptitudes than it's more appetites than aptitudes. You need a certain aptitude. But if you've seen these mathematically gifted kids, they talk math, they joke math, they hang out with kids who can talk and joke math. It's really quite remarkable. They're creating an environment correlated with their genetic propensities. And so I think that's, a lot of these are just sort of lessons for parents to think about, but mostly to counter the environmentalism that still persists with these thousands. If you go on Amazon, Google parenting books, there's over 10,000 entries. And none of them talk about genetics. And they all get their publicity by making young parents anxious, by saying, if you don't do this, your kid's going to be screwed up for life. One false step. And if parents really believe that, how horrible it must be being a parent. You know, the responsibility of thinking one false move and I've messed my kid up for life. And so we need to know kids are much more resilient than we think, and we need to think of ourselves as in a relationship rather than like producing good little citizens or something. You know, it's an important shift in the way we think about parenting. Another aspect to it is being a resource manager in a way, helping your kid find out what they're good at. You know, noticing, oh, they like that. You know, maybe they'd like this, and helping them find the things that capitalizes on their strengths and abilities. I say in the book, the joy of parenting is watching your child become who they are, rather than thinking you're going to make them into what you want them to be.
I'd love to stay on that slightly. How has your research, what you've written, what you've read, influenced how you are as a parent? You mentioned grandchildren as well. How's it, or has it changed what you're like as a parent or grandparent?
Well, I got into the genetics before I had kids. So by the time I had kids, I was quite aware of it and realizing, you know, some of the things I've just been saying. I don't know if I was always so good at doing it. Like I had a major issue with my adolescent boys who, I think genetics of orneriness is something, and I definitely have orneriness genes, which helped me survive doing genetic research in psychology at a time when it was sort of dangerous politically and professionally to even talk about genetics. You had to have a thick skin and, you know, it's sort of orneriness in a way, saying, well, I'll show you, you know, and just do the research and that sort of thing. But I think my kids inherited that as well. And so one of the things in adolescence is I thought to be a cultured person, you ought to know how to read music. So, you know, just take your music lessons, your piano lessons, and learn how to read music. And being ornery, they said, oh, that's what you want me to do. I'm not going to do that. And, you know, they like music, but also, I think they could see that they weren't that good at it. Their friends, without any music lessons, were composing music, you know? And so they're not dumb, and they say, well, I really don't want to do that. There's, you know, life is short, and there's other things I want to do. And so I made the mistake of kind of thinking I was going to impose on them my ideas of what a kid ought to be, like, what ought to do. And it actually created significant problems because they were just at that stage, you know, where they're kind of rebellious anyway. And I liked that, but it got to be pretty bad until I realized, who cares? I mean, in the long run. I mean, maybe in the end they'll come back to music and they'll say, Father was right, you know, maybe I should learn how to do it, but probably not for the reason. It's almost like I don't know if it was status or whatever. I think I was better motivated than that. I sort of wanted them to enjoy music, and to do that, you ought to be able to read music. But that's not necessarily true. I mean, I don't know. I think I was ruined for music because I had to so much learn to play music. You know, you play the notes exactly as they're written. And that might be counterproductive to being a musician, you know, and composing and being extemporaneous about it and lighter about it, you know? So that's just an example of ways in which I didn't apply it in my life, but mostly I did. I mean, I recognize that, fortunately, my sons were all very good at school, but the hardest thing for university-educated parents is to realize that their kids are 50% similar to them and to each other, but 50% different. And so if you get a kid who isn't academically oriented, genetics predicts that will happen. On average, bright parents will have kids who are brighter and better at school, but it's just an average, and there's quite a range of difference around that. And so I think parents ought to, you know, again, realize and respect genetic differences even within their own family, to realize that their two kids are genetically different 50%.
What about you as an individual? How's it changed how you've lived your life?
Well, increasingly, I try to go with the genetic flow. So I was talking about cocktail parties, you know, especially in America, but even in England to some extent, you know, to be a cool adult, you got to go to parties and meet a lot of people you don't know. And I realized I don't like that. And then I realized I don't have to do that. But as I say, it doesn't mean it's deterministic. It just means, and as I said, I can definitely put on the mask if I want to, and I can glad hand people, that sort of thing. But why should I? There aren't many situations where I have to do it. I don't have to do it to show other people I'm a cool individual. I can just say, no thanks, I don't like cocktail parties. I was just invited to this, I have a house in Norfolk, and there's this famous sort of party where all the, there's a lot of aristocrats and people there. So I'm finally into the point after living there 25 years where I'm invited to this party. And I realized, I don't want to go. I'm not going to go. Even though a lot of people would cut off a limb because, it's the party to go to in Norfolk, for example. And so that's an example of it. And to realize, to spend more time figuring out what you like to do and what you're good at. And I mean, it only seems like common sense, doesn't it? But so many of us are doing stuff that if we took a minute to say, why are we doing this? Is this really what I want to do? And I think there's a lot more room for that. So recognizing and respecting genetic influences in you as well as respecting them in other people.
We've spoken a lot about these incredible findings that we have now that can inform how we live our lives, how we conduct things like parenting. What big questions in genetic research are currently unanswered, or are you looking forward to hearing the answers from?
Yeah. Well, the biggest question in genomics, that is in the DNA sort of research, is what's called missing heritability. So we know that on average, psychological traits are 50% heritable. But with the DNA technologies, and we could go into those, but and they've been very important. They've revolutionized biological science, and they're going to change psychology a lot. They're already starting to do that. You can't get a big grant in psychology where you don't collect DNA, because it just adds the whole genetic perspective to whatever you want to do. To study the effects of CBT on depression, you've got to say, maybe that effect differs for people with different genetic propensities. So missing heritability is the gap between the genes we've identified that predict a trait and the heritability of, say, 50%. So we're not really above 20% or 25%. So the gap is between 25% of the variants we can predict with DNA versus 50%. That's the ceiling. We'll never predict 100% because it's only 50% heritable. But that missing heritability gap is the biggest issue right now. And it's probably, it's kind of technical explanations, but right now we're sampling the genome. We're measuring hundreds of thousands of these DNA differences throughout the 23 pairs of chromosomes, the 3 billion base pairs of DNA. But the thing now is whole genome sequencing, where you don't sample DNA differences. You actually, people know the human genome sequence. That's all 3 billion base pairs of DNA. It costs $250 million and 250 researchers 10 years to do that. One genome, and then to discover there is no human genome. We all have millions of DNA differences. Well, now we can do that for maybe 500 pounds. And so that's all she wrote in terms of genetics, right? That's all you inherit is that DNA sequence, those 3 billion base pairs of DNA. So most of us feel that by not just sampling the genome, but actually measuring every single DNA base, we've got to get there. We've got to close that missing heritability gap. The problem probably will be, though, that many of those DNA differences are very rare, which from a statistical point of view means it's very hard to detect them. You need bigger and bigger samples. But I think with AI and the fact that the brightest scientists are doing this, because it's the same issue for medical science as it is for behavioral science. Everything's just the same. And so I'm optimistic that it will work out, and you can't keep up with the literature on it. There's so much going on this.
Yeah. You mentioned there genome sequencing. I wonder if you could explain some of these studies, how you have found all this research we've been talking about. You mentioned the early development twin study earlier, polygenic scores. Could you explain how you've got these findings?
Well, the twin and adoption studies, that's sort of quantitative genetics. And I never thought in my lifetime we'd have the DNA revolution that allows us to actually assess the DNA directly. Early on, we could only do that for like single gene disorders that have a huge effect, like Mendel's pea plant genes, you know. And so the DNA revolution came with these new technologies that allowed us to assess, to sample DNA variants throughout the genome. And that's called a SNP chip. And that allowed us from moving from kind of a single gene approach where we can only measure a few genotypes at a time because it's very expensive, very laborious, to now having a chip the size of a postage stamp that can assess at least 500,000 DNA differences quickly, like in a few hours, inexpensively. On the real cost, like 20 quid, but you know, if you do it at a commercial DNA testing company, it's maybe 150 pounds or something, but cheap and extremely accurately. So that technological advance made the difference in finding genes related to complex traits and common disorders, where we're not just looking for the gene, but we're looking for the thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of DNA difference, each of which contribute just a tiny bit to the heritability. But because the effects are additive, we can add them up and create what we call a multiple genic score, polygenic score. And that's what's really revolutionizing the behavioral sciences now. And I bet many of your listeners have done 23andMe or Ancestry.com, and that uses that technique called a SNP, single nucleotide polymorphism chip, SNP chip. It's a DNA microarray that allows you to genotype hundreds of thousands of DNA markers for one individual very quickly, cheaply, and accurately. And then if you do that once, you can create the hundreds of polygenic scores that are available, not just for medical risks like cardiovascular disease, but also for psychological traits, because you use those same DNA markers to say, you weight them differently according to which SNPs are associated with which trait. So that, I think, is the major reason why the DNA revolution has been so successful. And as I said, I never thought that would happen in my lifetime.
Robert, thank you so much for talking to me.
Great pleasure.
That was a really fun conversation. I really appreciate you talking to us. Thank you.
Well, my pleasure.